Recently, I was shopping online when I saw this book. As someone who has spent the last 3 years leaving the labels and community that surrounded my faith, at times like Christmas, I can feel the void more than others. Upon opening the book, I found myself blown away by even the titles. As someone who has been rather obsessed with new ways of thinking, growth, and even ways to survive, this title speaks to me. But immediately, in the first page, I'm conflicted. There's a line that says, "We may be visited by a spirit of openness, generosity, energy, that the force may come over us, carry us to do obedient things that we have not yet done." Which leads me to ask the question, obedient to who? The implication, of course, is obedience to God. Obedience is defined as compliance with an order, request, or law or submission to another's authority. So my question is, who is this other? I really liked this idea of openness, generosity, energy, and new things we have not yet done, but now it seems like all of this is contingent upon my belief of a very specific person. And the label of this specific person is important in my own history, because this label was used to get people to do very specific things, all with the defense that this is what that being preferred. But coming back to my book, these inconsistencies are not enough to make me want to toss the whole thing out. But the more I read, the more conflicts I encountered. The new world of God is beyond our capacity and even beyond our imagination. It does not seem possible. In Advent, we receive the power of God that lies beyond us, which leads me to ask this question: who is God? And if I am no longer 100% confident in His identity, can I still experience this openness, generosity, energy, and newness? I recently found this article written by Pete Enns. It's kind of confusing because in this article, Pete is quoting another theologian named Paul Tillich. Tillich says, "A God whose existence, or non-existence you can argue, is a thing beside others within the universe of existing things." Pete Enns draws this out, saying, seeing God as a thing is the same as seeing Him or it as a being that exists. And this is a problem. Pete goes on to say, "Over the years, it has rung true to me more and more that speaking of God as a being, though hard to avoid, is not helpful, because it treats God as yet another thing in this universe, alongside all the other things, just a much bigger thing." Now, this bigger thing being is very important, because although most Christians will say something like God is unfathomable, their entire lives are a testament to just how fathomable He actually is. Even the use of a pronoun like He is a great example that while they may say He's impossible to wrap your mind around, we very much have our mind wrapped around Him. This is most notably true in the way Christians determine His will throughout the course of history by saying things like, He wants us to have slaves, He wants us to not kill people, or save sex until marriage. I'm not even saying these are bad things, but even the very act of framing up a being that is basically like us and has a definition, a set of desires and aversions, shows how much some claim to understand this thing. Pete says the biggest danger of reducing God to our image or treating Him as yet another thing in the universe is really saying that there is no God at all, just bigger us's. To Tillich, this discovery that God isn't best understood as a being isn't in fact bad news, but good news. He says, "It is regrettable that scientists believe that they have refuted religion when they rightly have shown that there is no evidence whatsoever for the assumption that such a being exists. Actually, they not only have refuted religion, but they have done it a considerable service. They have forced it to reconsider and to restate the meaning of the tremendous word, God. In other words, the historical enemy of the church, science, is not only not dangerous to the church's mission, but can actually be of service.
You win!
As this standard definition of a God that is just a larger dabbling being that actually doesn't exist doesn't need to be a threat. It can actually contain a bit of a promise. If God isn't a being, what is he? It, or whatever. Now at first, you may think that Tillich or Pete are against the idea of God, but this is a false assumption, one that I held for many years about anyone that opposed my specific language. I believe that their idea of God is actually much bigger and more powerful than what I was taught in Sunday school. Pete says, scientists have dethroned the anthropomorphic God as an object of logical certainty and analysis. So it isn't God that science has dethroned, a God that, quoting the mystics, is mystery and therefore infinitely knowable, but just an anthropomorphic God, a God who is like us. All right, so what's the big deal with creating an anthropomorphic God versus a God that is, well, bigger? According to Tillich, many theologians make the same mistake. They begin their message with the assertion that there is a highest being called God, whose authoritative revelations they have received. They are more dangerous for religion than the so-called atheist scientists. Pete explains, when God is objectified, Christians have wound up pitting their objectified God against others, and people get hurt, whether in religious wars or driven from their religious community. Now, the Christians I know would say, well, that's just the cost of doing business. We're just the messengers, which is what I used to think. Growing up, my view of God was based upon my certainty, my attachment to certain symbols and names, until the comedian Pete Holmes changed my mind. Pete Holmes taught me that whatever your view of God is, it has to be metaphorical in some way. In his book, Comedy, Sex, God, which I highly recommend, he shares his lessons from Joseph Campbell, the guy who influenced the writing of this. And Pete Holmes says, my whole life, I had thought of God as the answer, the thing you point to, not another thing pointing to another thing. God has always been the last Russian doll in the chain of progressively smaller Russian dolls. But Joseph Campbell didn't agree. His definition of God wasn't about knowing. His definition of God was about coming to terms with our perpetual unknowing. Joseph Campbell said, God is a metaphor for a mystery that absolutely transcends all categories of human thought, including being and non-being. This helped me see that the more metaphorical your view of God is, it's not that this God loses power, actually the opposite. Pete Holmes concludes, instead of something you know, and something you know, and something you know correctly so you are in, and others are out, Campbell says that there is one more doll inside the God doll, a mystery. You can't even picture it. No image would suffice. Some things are just too immense to trap with language. Now I think even the Bible forces us to draw this conclusion. Wait, is he a person? A bush? A pillar of fire? A man? So to die on any one of these hills is to miss the point. A metaphor is a symbol. These things all point to something else. So we can die on the hill of our specific metaphor, but even the Bible seems to indicate this is a bad idea. This is indicated in the Ten Commandments, which command the people against having idols or even physical symbols. And it also becomes evident in the famous story of the burning bush, where Moses was appointed by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and into the Promised Land.
Let my people go.
And yet when Moses asked, "What do I tell them when they ask your name?" God's response is to choose, "I will be who I will be?" God's answer, or non-answer, is like helping someone asking you for directions in Wingdings, which seems to be kind of a dick move, unless there might be another motive. Robert Alter, the dude who literally wrote the most recent translation of the Hebrew Bible, explains, God's response perhaps gives Moses more than he bargained for, not just an identifying divine name, but an ontological divine mystery of the most daunting character. In other words, God's response wasn't so much an answer as it was a recategorization. So, as in your face a burning bush might be, God's answer seems to indicate that he did not want to be confused with actually being the burning bush, or anything for that matter. Translated to our times, it seems like the second we start to think that our metaphor is God, instead of merely something that was meant to point to God, we're somehow missing the entire point of God, and maybe not quite as knowledgeable or connected as we think we are. If this is true, is it actually helpful to insist on using a metaphor if it hurts as many people as it helps? Basically, you know you're talking about a metaphorical God instead of a force so large and powerful that it redefines ontological categories when you feel the need to defend its validity. It is often these metaphors that have been used to enforce ideas and cause violence. And this is where we have to remember that even in the biblical stories, it was never the metaphor that was the point. Jesus himself never asked to be worshipped. The bush, the pillar of fire, they were all pointing to something beyond. And maybe it's the very fact that this essence, this reality, remains beyond that helps it to keep its power. Maybe imagining beyond our metaphor and not insisting it be inserted is a sign of strength, not weakness. And so I went back to my book and I decided to remove a few things. We may be visited by a spirit of openness, generosity, energy, that the force may come over us, carry us to do things we have not yet done. The new world is beyond our capacity and even beyond our imagination. It does not seem possible. I was taught that removing symbols or words was very dangerous, sacrilegious, and prideful. But I have found that focusing on a reality outside of myself that I want and need to grow and do not understand is a very humbling experience. And to not have a name for it and not need a name for it, this makes me more curious, more accepting, and I believe more loving. And it causes me to be more attracted to and accepting of other curious and loving people, regardless of the metaphor they are using. Something I was not able to do when I insisted that I knew who God was. And so, I wonder if the best way to honor God, or the reality or force beyond the metaphors, is to be aware of how the metaphors we use resonate with the people around us. Are we using them to truly love people? Which, if there really is a God, is what I really hope he, her, they, or it wants? Or are we just using the metaphor to make ourselves feel better? I don't know. But either way, I hope in this season you may be visited by a spirit of openness, generosity, energy, and that the force may come over us, carry us to do things we have not yet done.